Welcome back. We're picking up where we left off.
Yes, we are.
Last time, we covered Ezra 1 through 6, which was that whole deep dive into the initial return under Cyrus and, the really long, stalled-out project of finally completing the temple.
Right, the second temple.
Exactly. So today, we're moving forward. We're jumping roughly 60 years ahead in the historical timeline to Ezra chapters 7 through 10.
Which is when Ezra himself actually shows up.
Right. And for those of you joining us, we have a pretty clear agenda for this deep dive. First, we'll walk through the narrative arc of these 4 chapters just to lay the groundwork.
That's establish a story.
Then secondly, we're going to look at the Ezra memoir as this sort of source-critical puzzle, which leads directly into a massive chronological debate about whether Ezra arrived before or after Nehemiah.
That's a huge one.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
Third, we're going to examine the rescript of Artaxerxes and the whole scholarly debate around Persian imperial authorization. Fourth, we'll get into the really difficult stuff, the intermarriage crisis, this concept of the holy seed, and the canonical tension this creates when you read it next to the book of Ruth.
Which is a really sharp tension.
Very sharp.
Yeah.
And finally, we will wrap up with the devotional section, reflecting on intercession, the restoration, and how we hold that scriptural tension today.
Sounds good. So to begin, we really need to establish the historical overview, just set the stage.
Right.
We are stepping into a very specific moment in the ancient Near East. The Second Temple has been standing and functioning in Jerusalem since 516 BC.
So it's been a while.
Yeah, a few decades. The Persian Empire, the Achaemenid dynasty, has seen several kings rise and fall in the meantime. And the year is now roughly the 7th year of the reign of King Artaxerxes.
Okay.
And way over in Babylon, a significant distance from Jerusalem, a priest and scribe named Ezra is getting ready to set out for the province of Yehud.
Which is what the Persians called Judah.
Exactly.
And the text introduces Ezra with, it's just this intense, deliberate care. If you're reading chapter 7, it opens with a meticulously constructed genealogy.
A very long one.
Yeah. It traces his lineage backward through this whole chain of priestly ancestors until it connects directly to Aaron, the very first high priest of Israel.
Right. They're doing something very specific there.
They're credentialing him. Making sure you, the reader, know that his authority is grounded in the absolute highest priestly pedigree available in the tradition.
Yeah, and alongside that biological credential, there's an intellectual one. The text repeats this specific formula, introducing him as a ready scribe in the law of Moses.
A ready scribe.
Right, and that's a crucial designation. He's not just someone who knows how to read and write. In the ancient world, a scribe of this caliber is a scholar. He's an interpreter, a custodian of the sacred tradition.
So we have to view him through this dual lens. Legitimate priest by birth and master of the Torah by rigorous study.
Exactly. So Ezra prepares to leave Babylon, and he doesn't go alone. He leads this second wave of returnees.
Right. The text lists all these families and numbers, which it really deliberately echoes those massive lists of exiles we saw back in chapter 2.
It does. But what makes this specific journey unique is what Ezra is carrying.
The document.
The document. He has this rescript from the Persian king Artaxerxes. And this isn't just, a passport or a royal seal of safe passage.
Right.
It's a sweeping legal and political mandate. It authorizes Ezra to transport a vast fortune of state-sponsored silver and gold to the temple.
Just a massive amount of wealth.
Yeah, but it goes way beyond logistics. The letter grants Ezra the power to appoint magistrates and judges throughout the entire province, specifically judges who know the laws of thy God.
Okay, so a judicial mandate.
And an educational one. He's supposed to teach the law to those who don't know it. But perhaps most significantly, it empowers him to enforce this law with severe Persian state penalties.
Right. The text explicitly lists death, banishment, confiscation of goods, and imprisonment.
Yeah.
Just to pause on that he is essentially handed a blank check of state power.
Pretty much.
The text claims the Persian king is saying, go enforce your specific religious law, and if anyone disobeys, you have the authority of the state to execute them or banish them.
It's a staggering amount of power for a local priest to hold in a massive empire.
So he takes this document, the wealth, his caravan, and makes the long journey to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
He arrives, delivers the treasure, offers sacrifices. Everything seems to be going exactly to plan.
Well, that sense of order is very brief.
Right.
Shortly after he settles in, the narrative just pivots sharply to a profound crisis. Local officials come to Ezra with a formal report. They inform him that the people of Israel, and they explicitly name the priests and the Levites in this group, have intermarried with the surrounding populations.
And his reaction is just visceral. He doesn't just nod and call a committee meeting.
No, not at all.
The text says he tears his garments, he literally pulls hair from his head and his beard,
Yeah.
and he just sits there appalled, like in a state of shock until the evening sacrifice. And then he falls to his knees and offers this very public, collective prayer of confession.
Which initiates a really rigorous response. Chapter 10 details this whole process. A massive public assembly is called, and it happens to take place in the 9th month during the heavy winter rains.
So they're all just sitting out there freezing.
Right. The text paints this grim picture of the people in the open square, trembling from the severity of the issue and from the pouring rain. They set up a commission to investigate the marriages on a case-by-case basis.
Which takes a while.
It takes 3 full months to complete.
And then, and this is where it gets tough, the narrative just drops off a cliff.
It really does.
The book ends abruptly and quite uncomfortably. There's no triumphant final scene, no dedication of a building. It just concludes with a bare roster, a ledger of names.
Yeah.
The men who were investigated and who are now required to separate from their foreign wives and the children born to them. That is the final image of the book of Ezra. Broken families.
Which serves as a good pivot from the narrative to the scholarly framing. We need to transition into the analytical questions this text really demands we ask.
All right, let's get into it.
We'll focus on 3 main academic threads for this deep dive. First, the composition and chronology. The text shifts into a first-person perspective, which raises questions about the Ezra material.
Right.
And that leads into the debate about which Artaxerxes this was and the Nehemiah timeline. Second, we'll analyze the Persian imperial policy. Did the empire actually ratify the Torah?
Right, the Peter Phrase stuff.
Exactly.
Okay.
And third, we'll look at the anthropological and textual analysis of that severe intermarriage crisis.
Okay, so let's start with that first thread, the Ezra memoir and the chronological puzzle.
Yeah.
If you're reading carefully through chapters 7 through 10, you definitely notice a sudden shift in the grammar.
Yeah, the pronouns change.
Right. The text moves from talking about Ezra in the third person to Ezra speaking in the first person. We see phrases like, I gathered together and I proclaimed a fast.
And scholars refer to this material as the Ezra memoir.
So how do they understand this shift?
Well, the standard reconstruction was developed by H.G.M. Williamson. He proposed that Ezra 7 through 10 is not a single seamless document, but a composite.
A composite of what?
It weaves together underlying source materials, the Aramaic rescript, the genealogies, a narrative framework, and it integrates all that with Ezra's first-person memoir.
Okay.
But Williamson made a really crucial observation about the structure. He argued that the original Ezra memoir did not end abruptly at chapter 10 with that list of severed marriages.
Right. Williamson proposed that if you look at the source material, the memoir originally continued straight into what we now read as Nehemiah chapter 8.
Exactly.
And Nehemiah 8 is that famous scene where Ezra stands on the wooden platform and reads the law aloud to the entire assembly.
Yeah, the linguistic style, the thematic focus on the law, the prominence of Ezra, all of it suggests that Nehemiah 8 is the organic continuation of the Ezra narrative.
But, and this is the driving structural question, if we accept Williamson's reconstruction, which makes a lot of sense, why would a later biblical editor deliberately chop that source in half?
Right.
Why take Nehemiah's material, the wall building, and wedge it directly between Ezra's arrival in chapter 10 and his public reading in Nehemiah 8? What's the editorial logic there?
It's a question of theological priorities overriding strict chronological reporting.
We've seen that before.
We have. Ancient editors organize material thematically all the time. In this case, the final editor of the compilation likely wanted readers to experience Ezra and Nehemiah not as isolated figures in different silos, but as overlapping contemporaries.
Working together.
Exactly. They wedge Nehemiah's narrative into Ezra's timeline so the two figures converge. The architecture builds toward a specific climax, their joint appearance at the dedication of the wall in Nehemiah 12.
So if the editor had left the Ezra memoir intact and then put Nehemiah's intact memoir after it, that sense of unified restoration will be lost.
Completely lost. The literary arrangement serves a deliberate theological purpose.
Which brings us directly to the chronological puzzle. Because if you read the text literally, Ezra arrived in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, and Nehemiah arrived later, in the 20th year.
Right, and if we assume the king is Artaxerxes I, which is the traditional assumption, The math places Ezra's arrival in 458 BC. Nehemiah would then arrive 13 years later in 445 BC.
Meaning Ezra is in Jerusalem for over a decade before Nehemiah even shows up to build the wall.
Exactly. But there's a substantial counter-theory dating back to at least 1890. What if the Artaxerxes who sent Ezra wasn't Artaxerxes the first, but his grandson, Artaxerxes the second?
Which changes everything.
It shifts Ezra's arrival to 398 BC. That would mean Ezra arrives 53 years after Nehemiah. It completely reverses the order.
So Nehemiah comes first, builds the wall, establishes order, and then decades later, Ezra arrives to teach the law.
Right. And we should outline the arguments for this reversed order because they rely on significant internal tensions within the text.
Okay, let's hear them.
The primary argument rests on textual silence. If we follow the traditional timeline, Ezra and Nehemiah are supposedly contemporaries living in the same small city for over a decade. Yet outside of those carefully edited joint scenes, their respective memoirs never directly interact.
Which is so strange. If you're the governor and the high priest is initiating a massive, society-altering divorce proceeding, you'd think it might show up in your notes.
Right. They don't reference each other's policies during their major crises. And beyond the silence, there are environmental clues.
Like what?
Well, when Ezra arrives, he addresses a community that feels settled. They have a functioning temple infrastructure, socioeconomic stability. But when Nehemiah arrives, supposedly 13 years later, he describes a city in ruins, economically desperate.
So Ezra never mentions a ruined wall, and Nehemiah never mentions Ezra having stabilized the religious community.
Exactly. The conditions Ezra describes seem to reflect a later stage of provincial development long after Nehemiah had built the physical defenses.
Which makes the 398 DC date really appealing. It resolves a lot of narrative tension.
It does.
But the traditional 458 BC date has robust defense. And we have to talk about Frank Moore Cross here.
Oh, absolutely.
Cross utilized evidence from the Samaria papyri to defend the traditional timeline. And to understand his argument, we need to explain paponymy.
Right. Paponymy is a naming convention common in the ancient Near East where a grandson is named after his grandfather. So you get a pattern, Sanballat I, his son Deliah, his son Sanballat II, and so on.
So Cross analyzed these papyri to reconstruct the lineages of the governors of Samaria,
who are contemporaries and often antagonists of the leaders in Jerusalem.
And by mapping out these alternating names, Cross created an external timeline. Then he cross-referenced that with the genealogical data of the high priests in the biblical text.
Right, and when he aligned the generations, he concluded the data firmly supported the traditional sequence, placing Ezra in the mid-5th century under Artaxerxes I.
There's also the internal evidence from Chronicles, because the genealogies in Chronicles appear to terminate shortly before 400 BC. If the final compiler of Chronicles and the editor of Ezra Nehemiah are in the same historical window, placing Ezra in 398 BC creates a serious conflict.
It would mean Ezra is just beginning his reforms after the chronicler's material already assumes the community's structures are deeply established. It throws the canonical timeline out of alignment.
Okay, so the genealogical arguments are strong, but what about the practical historical realities of 458 BC?
And this is where the historical objections become acute. During the early reign of Artaxerxes I, around 459 and 458 BC, the Achaemenid Empire was not at peace.
No, they were dealing with a massive revolt in Egypt.
Right, led by a Libyan prince named Inaros, who was heavily backed by the Athenians. And the logistics of this are crucial. The Persian military response required a vast mobilization. They had to march massive armies from the eastern parts of the empire right through the Levant, meaning through Syria and Judah down into Egypt.
So the entire region of Yehud would have been a military transit zone, a staging ground.
Exactly. The roads would be heavily militarized, resources requisitioned. The security of the region was focused entirely on suppressing the rebellion.
Which makes the traditional timeline logistically absurd. I mean, if the king's entire military apparatus is consumed with a massive war in Egypt, why would he choose that exact moment in 458 BC to dispatch an unescorted civilian priest?
Right.
Ezra travels without a military guard, carrying a literal fortune in gold and silver, walking right through a militarized, unstable territory.
Sending a treasury caravan through a war zone makes absolutely no sense.
It's a severe historical objection.
It is, and it highlights why this remains an open problem. There's no absolute consensus. The traditional date has canonical precedent and crosses arguments, but the counter-arguments regarding textual silence, the state of Jerusalem, and the Egyptian revolt are not easily dismissed.
It's a perfect example of how historical investigation complicates a text. But for the rest of this deep dive, We'll proceed using the canonical order, assuming 458 BC, because that's the sequence the final editor expects us to read.
But keep the uncertainty in mind.
Absolutely. So let's move to our second main section, Ezra as the scribe lawgiver, and the specific nature of his imperial authorization.
The rescript.
Right, the rescript in Ezra 7, verses 12 through 26. As we mentioned, it grants Ezra significant power. He's to appoint judges who know the laws of thy God.
And crucially, it gives him the power of state violence. Verse 26 states that anyone who will not obey the law of thy God and the law of the king will face judgment.
Death, banishment, confiscation, imprisonment. And that phrasing is the center of a massive academic debate. The text places the law of God and the law of the king right next to each other.
Which led to a highly influential theory proposed in 1984 by Peter Frey. He looked at the broader administration of the empire and proposed this concept of Persian imperial authorization.
So how does Frey's theory actually work?
Frey argued that the empire, which was massive, faced a huge administrative burden. To maintain stability and prevent rebellions, they needed a systematic policy. He suggested that instead of imposing Persian law everywhere, the empire would take the indigenous legal codes of a subject people, formally ratify them in the royal court, and elevate them to the status of imperial law within that province.
So it's kind of like the federal government stepping into a state, looking at their local zoning ordinances and saying, okay, these are now federal laws enforced by federal agents.
Exactly. And under Frey's theory, Ezra 7 is the historical record of this happening for the Jewish people. It represents the moment the Achaemenid Empire formally authorized the Torah, or a Proto-Pentateuch, giving it the full coercive backing of the state.
And for a while, this theory was widely accepted, right?
It was. It seemed to perfectly explain the rescript, but over time it faced severe pushback. In 2001, James Watts edited a volume that systematically dismantled much of Frey's thesis.
We should walk through those critiques.
Let's start with Joseph Blenkinsop and Lester Grab. They targeted the comparative evidence Frey relied on. Frey had pointed to examples from Egypt and Asia Minor.
But Blenkinsop and Grab pointed out that the evidence is remarkably thin.
Very thin. The few instances of Persian administrators showing interest in local customs don't add up to a systematic policy. The Persian administration was intensely pragmatic. They cared about tribute, secure borders. They didn't have the time or manpower to meticulously review and ratify the religious legal systems of every conquered territory.
And Grab takes it even further regarding the text of Ezra 7 itself.
He does.
He argues that the exact wording of the rescript, especially where the Persian king sounds deeply invested in the nuances of Judean temple sacrifices, is likely a later exaggerated elaboration by a Jewish author.
Right. He sees it not as a precise historical transcript, but as a theological projection, expanding a historical core into full imperial backing.
And then Lisbeth Fried offered another critique that just scales down Ezra's mission entirely.
She argued that the idea of Artaxerxes authorizing a fixed written document like the Pentateuch is anachronistic. She suggested the king was merely appointing royal administrators to maintain order.
So when the rescript uses the phrase, the law of your God, what does she think it means?
She argues it reflects a vague general Persian concept of justice. The Persians had a concept called arta truth, order, cosmic stability. The Egyptians had mat. Fried suggests the law of his God is a broad diplomatic mandate to maintain stability, not a royal endorsement of the Mosaic Code.
Basically, keep the peace using whatever local traditions work.
Exactly. And then Gary Knoppers focused on the specific grammatical phrasing in verse 26. He pushed back against Frey conflating the two laws.
Right. When it says the law of thy God and the law of the king, Knoppers argued the text is explicitly keeping them distinct.
Yes. Persian imperial law taxes treason operates alongside Judean religious law, but the empire does not absorb the Torah into its own legal apparatus. They run on parallel tracks.
So Frey's broad theory is largely rejected today. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, this deconstruction forces us to pivot.
It does.
Because if the Persian Empire didn't actually care about the minutiae of Judean law, why did the biblical author desperately need to claim that they did?
Which moves us into the psychology of the text. Regardless of the exact historicity, the text is making an intentional theological claim. It's asserting that Ezra's authority is backed by the coercive power of the greatest empire on earth.
And if you put yourself in the shoes of that post-exilic community, you can understand why they needed that.
Oh, absolutely.
They're traumatized people. Conquered, exiled, and now this remnant has returned to a ruined province. They are a tiny minority surrounded by hostile neighbors. No standing army. The Davidic kings are gone. In this precarious state, they needed their restored practice of the Torah to feel secure, to feel unassailable.
Claiming imperial backing was a survival mechanism. It established unshakable legitimacy. If the Torah is backed by the sword of Artaxerxes, local enemies will think twice before interfering.
And this connects directly to how the text characterizes Ezra. As we noted, he's the ready scribe. His authority is textual. He's not a general or a king. He functions as a second lawgiver.
Right. But unlike Moses at Sinai, Ezra is a scholar. He is representing the law for a people who had lost daily access to it during the exile, wielding the text as the foundation of a renewed society.
And it is precisely that textual authority and the strict enforcement of it that he exercises so dramatically in our third section, the intermarriage crisis and the holy seed.
Right. Let's examine chapters 9 and 10. As we noted, the leaders tell Ezra the people haven't separated from the peoples of the lands and have taken foreign wives.
But the vocabulary the text uses is fascinating. The report lists the groups: Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites.
What stands out to you there?
It's an anachronism.
Yes.
It's a deliberate echo of the conquest-era lists from Deuteronomy. If you're living in 458 BC, there are no Jebusites or Perizzites walking around. Those groups don't historically exist anymore.
Right. It would be like a modern politician complaining about the Visigoths moving into the suburbs.
Exactly. The author is using ancient theological categories to describe the contemporary populations.
Because by labeling them as Canaanites and Hittites, the text categorizes them as the ancient archetypal enemies of Israel's purity. It legitimizes the severe reaction.
And his reaction is intense. The collective confession, the investigative commission in the reign, families dismantled. So why was this perceived as an existential threat?
Catherine Southwood at Oxford provides great insight here with the concept of ethnic labeling. In Ezra 9.2, the text calls the returnees the holy seed, and it reduces the surrounding population to an anonymous mass called the peoples of the lands.
So it's a rhetorical strategy. Holy seed is pure, chosen. Peoples of the lands is impure, a threat, a stark binary boundary.
Yes, and Willa Johnson builds on this by examining the specific nature of the threat. In earlier texts, like during the Kings, the danger of foreign wives is framed as a cultic or moral failing. The fear is idolatry.
Like Solomon's wives turning his heart to other gods.
Exactly. But Johnson points out that in Ezra 9 and 10, the anxiety is framed differently. The threat is not primarily cultic practice, it's genealogical contamination. The holy seed implies biological bloodline purity. The physical mixture itself is the defilement, regardless of whether the wives worship Yahweh.
Which is a striking shift toward exclusionary genealogy, especially when we bring Gary Knopper's comparative approach back in. We talked about Chronicles in a previous deep dive. Both Chronicles and Ezra Nehemiah are addressing the same community in the same period.
Yet their approaches are radically different.
They are competing theological visions. Chronicles constructs an inclusive genealogy. It easily absorbs intermarried lines, like the descendants of Meskir who married an Aramean woman. No anxiety at all.
But Ezra Nehemiah constructs exclusive defensive boundaries, demanding expulsion.
And this tension makes sense when you consider the socioeconomic realities.
Right.
You have a small group returning to a resource-scarce province, claiming land that has been occupied by others for generations.
And in an agrarian society, land ownership is everything. It's survival.
Exactly. So if you're a returnee and your neighbor marries a non-returning woman, what happens when he dies? The land potentially passes to her family outside the group of returnees.
Which is a real threat.
Right. So we have to ask, is the theology of the holy seed masking an underlying economic pragmatism? Could this strict boundary be a legal mechanism to protect land rights? If you invalidate the marriages, you invalidate the inheritance claims of the children, keeping resources within the returning minority. Theology makes a very convenient mask for economics.
It is highly plausible that socioeconomic factors contributed significantly. Protecting property rights is a powerful motivation. But we can't simply reduce the text to economics and dismiss the theology.
Sure.
The author genuinely believed in the holy seed. Both realities, economic pragmatism and theological worldview, likely operated simultaneously, reinforcing each other in a very powerful way.
And the rigid enforcement of these boundaries brings us to what might be the most profound canonical tension in the Old Testament. Think about it. Ezra is amputating Moabite wives from the community, demanding men abandon their families in the freezing rain to maintain the holy seed.
Right.
But sitting right there in the same biblical canon is the Book of Ruth.
The contrast is staggering. The Book of Ruth centers entirely on a Moabite woman. In Ezra 9, Moabites are explicitly listed among the prohibited peoples. Yet the author of Ruth intentionally positions this Moabite woman as the great-grandmother of King David.
It's a canonical civil war playing out in the text. And Ruth's inclusion isn't just a tolerated exception. She is actively celebrated. The text highlights her history, her deep covenantal loyalty. Her faithfulness surpasses the native-born Israelites.
Which creates a fascinating scholarly debate. Was Ruth written deliberately as a polemical countervoice to Ezra's exclusionary ideology? A literary protest reminding the community that their greatest king possessed Moabite blood?
Some scholars argue precisely that. Others are cautious about dating the texts, suggesting that even if not a direct debate in real time, the tension is something later readers are meant to observe. The compilers intentionally place these conflicting voices together.
And as we conclude this analytical section, it is crucial that you, as the listener, sit with the textual discomfort of Ezra 10. Do not try to smooth it over.
No.
If you are unsettled by Ezra forcing men to abandon their wives and children, you should be. It is a brutal text. It ends on a ledger of broken families, with a deafening silence regarding the fate of those expelled women and children.
We must hold this tension. The text documents the defensible survival tactics of a vulnerable, traumatized community trying to preserve its identity. We can understand the fear, but the text remains deeply difficult to endorse, particularly when read against the expansive inclusivity of Ruth.
Which brings us to our devotional closing. And we acknowledge that shifting from the painful reality of Ezra 10 into a devotional space is difficult. Our reflection should not force a false resolution upon it. Instead, we'll focus on two themes relevant to Latter-day Saint theology: intercessory grief and the role of the ready scribe.
Let's look back at Ezra's posture in chapter 9. When he gets the report, his response is profound. He didn't commit this sin. He's innocent of it. Yet he doesn't distance himself. He doesn't stand on a platform of righteous judgment. He tears his clothes, sits in the dirt, and when he prays, he says, "Oh my God, I am ashamed, for our iniquities are increased over our head, and our trespasses grown up unto the heavens." He uses we. He owns the failure of the community as his own burden.
And this posture, owning the failures of a people without isolating oneself in judgment, is a profound form of intercession. It connects naturally to Jesus Christ. Ezra's grief is a mortal shadow of the Savior's perfect intercession.
Ezra can weep, but he can't save.
Right. Christ stands perfectly in the breach. The atonement involves taking on a burden of sin and suffering that was entirely not his own, bearing it completely for the community. Ezra's empathy points us toward a God who descends below all things to lift his people.
And the second theme centers on Ezra as a ready scribe. He's a man of texts, returning scripture to people who lost access to it during the exile. The continuity of living the law had been fractured. Ezra's role was to reestablish that foundation, translating and interpreting ancient texts into a lived reality.
Which resonates deeply with the early days of the Restoration and the role of Joseph Smith.
Absolutely.
Joseph was fundamentally a translator and a revealer of texts, bringing forth the Book of Mormon, the Revelations, and the Doctrine and Covenants. Like Ezra, Joseph's mission was to reestablish a lost inheritance for a modern people seeking a clearer understanding of the covenant. Both found their authority rooted in the recovery of the Word, providing a textual foundation for a renewed community.
But as we close, we must return to the difficult reality of chapter 10 and hold that canonical tension. We cannot soften this devotionally. It is a text born of a vulnerable community's genuine, desperate fear for its survival. They drew their boundaries tight. They acted out of self-preservation.
And yet, we must hold that reality alongside the Book of Ruth, where Ezra shows boundaries drawn tight by fear. Ruth shows the fuller, more expansive measure of God's welcome. Ruth demonstrates that covenant loyalty and divine purpose can transcend lineage and strict legalism.
We must guide ourselves to hold both truths in tension. We can maintain historical empathy for a fragile people protecting their covenant identity under pressure. But we must combine that with the wideness of the Savior's mercy celebrated in Ruth and fulfill in the gospel a mercy that transcends the rigid boundaries of the law, offering a more welcoming vision of the covenant family. Next time, we will move forward into the book of Nehemiah, examining the rebuilding of the wall and the massive covenant renewal ceremony in chapters 8 through 10. Until then.